The terminal at San Francisco International Airport buzzed with the usual mix of hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and muffled overhead announcements. But for Marcus Taylor, a decorated Marine veteran in his mid-40s, with broad frame, deep-set eyes, and a calm yet commanding presence, the day was meant to be purely about pride and joy. His only son, Jordan, was graduating from the United States Naval Academy, and Marcus had flown in early to make sure he was there to witness every moment. Dressed in a simple dark blue suit that barely concealed a hint of his muscular build, Marcus walked confidently toward the reserved seating area for VIP families, carrying only a small leather satchel, his Marine Corps lapel pin subtly gleaming under the terminal's fluorescent lights. Yet as he approached the cordoned-off section, two uniformed security guards, both young, stiff in their postures, and clearly eager to display their authority, stepped into his path. "Sir, this section is for guests of honor only," the taller one said with a faint sneer, scanning Marcus from head to toe with an expression that wasn't curiosity so much as judgment. Marcus calmly replied, "I'm here for my son's graduation. I have my clearance," reaching into his satchel for the invitation letter, but the shorter guard interrupted sharply. "We'll have to ask you to step away, sir. This area is for special guests, family of graduates. This is not for regular attendees." The implication in his tone was unmistakable, and Marcus felt a familiar heaviness in his chest, not of anger yet, but of recognition. He had been here before, in moments where the uniform he once wore seemed invisible to the people quick to judge him by the color of his skin rather than the life he had lived. Around them, a few travelers slowed, sensing a confrontation, and Marcus noticed how the taller guard's hand rested unnecessarily near the clip of his radio, almost as if preparing to escalate the situation. "I am the family of a graduate," Marcus said evenly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had led men into dangerous terrain and returned alive. But instead of acknowledging his words, the shorter guard chuckled under his breath, glanced at his partner, and said, "We'll have to escort you out of this area." At that moment, a flicker of frustration crossed Marcus's otherwise steady expression, not because they doubted his reason for being there, but because they doubted him. Before he could respond, one of the guards reached for his arm, a touch that was far too presumptuous, and in the split second before Marcus reacted, a low, controlled voice came from behind the security line. "Is there a problem here?" The crowd shifted slightly as 6 figures in Navy SEAL dress uniforms stepped forward, each one moving with the unshakable bearing of elite warriors, their eyes fixed on the 2 guards. The lead SEAL, a tall man with piercing gray eyes and a chest full of ribbons, walked directly up to Marcus, shook his hand firmly, and said, "It's good to see you, Gunny. We've been waiting for you." The sudden shift in the air was palpable. The guards froze, realizing too late the gravity of their mistake, while onlookers whispered among themselves, some raising their phones to record. The SEALs flanked Marcus without another word, their presence a silent declaration that this man was not just welcome, but honored. And as they escorted him to the cordoned area, the guards stepped back in stunned silence, the weight of their earlier assumptions settling heavily on their faces. Marcus didn't look back, but inside he knew this was only the beginning. What just happened would not go unnoticed, and the story of this moment, one born from quiet dignity and unshakable respect, was only about to unfold. The tension in the cabin had thickened like a storm cloud ready to burst, yet Raymond sat perfectly still, his gaze steady on a man who had just tried to have him removed, his badge still in hand. The gold letters Federal Bureau of Investigation gleaming under the cabin lights as the murmurs of passengers turned into a quiet hum of disbelief. The flight attendant, who had initially sided with the irate passenger, now stood frozen, her face pale as if she suddenly realized that the man she'd spoken down to was not just another traveler, but someone with far more authority than she could imagine. "Sir, she began, but her voice faltered under the weight of the moment. The entitled passenger, a middle-aged man in an expensive tailored suit with an arrogant smirk now replaced by a sickly shade of fear, stammered, This is a misunderstanding." But his words rang hollow. Raymond's deep, steady voice cut through the stale air. "You call me a threat in front of everyone here. You tried to use your influence to have me thrown off a flight without cause." The man shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet his eyes. The pilot, alerted by the commotion, emerged from the cockpit and hesitated for a moment, reading the tension in the scene. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone sharp. Raymond turned to him slowly. "Apparently, sitting in my assigned seat while black is enough to get me targeted." The statement hit the cabin like a slap, drawing sharp breaths from some passengers while others lowered their eyes in shame. A young woman in the next row spoke up softly. "I saw everything. He wasn't doing anything wrong." Her words seemed to tip the balance. The pilot's expression hardened as he looked between the flight attendant and the accuser. "This plane isn't leaving until this is resolved," he said firmly. Raymond leaned back slightly, still holding his badge in plain view, his calmness more intimidating than anger could have been. The entitled passenger began to sweat, clearly realizing that this was no longer a private power play. This was becoming a public reckoning. Somewhere in the back of the plane, someone muttered, "Serves him right," and others nodded silently. Raymond knew this wasn't over. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, the unspoken question of what he would do next. But in that moment, he didn't need to raise his voice or make a scene. The truth was already laid bare, and the balance of power had shifted entirely in his favor. The entire cabin felt like it was holding its breath as Special Agent Marcus Hale, still seated in his aisle seat, kept his eyes locked on the man who had tried to have him removed. The arrogant passenger, Gregory Whitmore, had sunk back into his chair, his smugness now replaced by a pale, shaky unease, his hands gripping the armrests as though they were the only thing keeping him grounded. Marcus could feel the stares from the other passengers, their earlier assumptions about him now replaced with curiosity and quiet respect. The flight attendant who had backed Gregory's complaint earlier was nowhere to be seen, clearly riled by the fact that the man they had tried to humiliate carried the authority of the FBI. Marcus's phone buzzed on the tray table. It was a secure message from his assistant director, acknowledging the disturbance report he had filed midair. He didn't need to say much. Everything was already being recorded and logged. What Gregory didn't realize was that Marcus wasn't just any agent. He was part of a counterintelligence task force working on a sensitive international case, and his presence on this flight was not optional. It was strategic. The thought that Gregory's racial bias had nearly interfered with federal operation only tightened the coiled spring of anger in Marcus's chest. But instead of lashing out, he remained composed, sipping his water with a calmness that unnerved Gregory even more. Then the pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing a brief weather delay before descending to Washington, D.C., and Marcus caught the faintest smirk from the two passengers across the aisle, an elderly black couple, who seemed to know exactly what kind of man Marcus was. Gregory shifted uncomfortably and muttered under his breath, "This isn't over," to which Marcus, without turning his head, replied in a voice low enough to feel like a warning, "You're right. It's not." Those 5 words seemed to chill Gregory's spine more than the turbulence rattling the plane. As they approached D.C., Marcus mentally prepared for the next move. Once they landed, certain people would be waiting at the gate, and Gregory was about to learn the consequences of turning prejudice into a public spectacle. The hum of the engines masked the heavy tension, but every second brought them closer to the ground and to a reckoning Gregory couldn't escape. The courtroom was so silent after Marcus's revelation that it felt as if time itself had stopped. The racist passenger, Charles Davenport, still stood there with his mouth open, his pale face drained of all color, clutching his expensive briefcase like it could shield him from the truth that had just crashed down upon him, while the other passengers, who had been watching from the back benches, exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispering in disbelief that the quiet black man Charles had tried to humiliate was actually Special Agent Marcus Kane of the FBI. The judge cleared his throat, but the gavel stayed still, as though even he knew the moment needed no interruption, and Marcus, his voice steady but carrying the weight of years of patience worn thin, began recounting in precise, unemotional detail the events of that flight, how Charles had approached him with arrogant entitlement, loudly suggesting to the flight attendants that men like him didn't belong in first class, how Marcus had initially ignored the provocation in the hope it would die out, and how, when Charles persisted, demanding the captain have him removed, Marcus had calmly produced his FBI credentials, triggering the sudden shift in power that still had everyone talking. As Marcus spoke, a new figure entered the courtroom, his partner, Agent Sophia Diaz, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s with a commanding presence that could silence a room without a word, and the click of her heels on the marble floor drew every gaze. She strode right up to the bench, presented an official sealed envelope to the judge, and explained in clipped tones that it contained recorded audio from the plane's cabin crew confirming not only Charles's verbal harassment, but also his attempt to interfere with a federal officer performing an undercover assignment. The judge's expression tightened, his eyes cutting toward Charles, who now looked like a man trying to shrink into his own tailored suit. Marcus stepped down from the witness stand, his gaze never breaking from Charles's, and for the first time, the racist businessman couldn't look back. Instead, he lowered his head, perhaps realizing that no amount of wealth, influence, or arrogance could erase the fact that his actions had exposed him as both a bigot and a fool. When the judge finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of finality that told everyone in the room there would be consequences. "Mr. Davenport, I advise you to prepare yourself for the full weight of the law." And as Charles's lawyer desperately requested a recess, Marcus and Sophia exchanged a brief nod, knowing the tide had turned and that justice, though sometimes slow, had just taken a decisive step forward. As the plane touched down at Washington Dulles International Airport, a tense silence hung in the air, the kind that comes after a storm but before the aftermath is fully realized. Marcus remained seated in his aisle seat, his FBI badge still clipped to his chest, the weight of the events from the flight heavy on everyone's minds. The racist passenger, Gregory Wainwright, sat rigidly 2 rows ahead, his once arrogant posture replaced by the hunched shoulders of a man who knew the walls were closing in. His wife avoided looking at him entirely, her face pale, the embarrassment of what had unfolded gnawing at her. As soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, Marcus stood, his tall, commanding presence drawing the eyes of passengers still reeling from the Madera confrontation. Without a word, he stepped into the aisle, pulling out his phone and dialing a secure line. "Special Agent Marcus Harris. We're wheels down. Send a team to Gate C-14, he said, his voice clipped professional, but with a simmering undertone of justice about to be served. The woman seated beside him, an elderly schoolteacher from Boston, touched his arm lightly. "I'm proud of you, young man," she whispered. Not many would have handled it with such grace. Marcus gave a small nod, his gratitude conveyed in the quiet strength of his eyes. When the cabin doors opened, the scene outside was unlike anything most passengers had ever seen. 4 FBI agents in dark suits stood waiting, flanked by 2 uniformed airport police officers. The moment Gregory stepped into the jet bridge, Marcus's voice rang out sharply. "Gregory Wainwright, you're under arrest." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the agents moved in, reading Gregory his rights, his protest. Something about a misunderstanding and knowing important people was drowned out by the click of handcuffs locking around his wrists. As the agents led him away, Marcus followed closely, his expression unreadable, but inside, a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion swirled. The truth was, Marcus hadn't wanted to humiliate the man. He wanted to protect the passengers, uphold the dignity of his position, and remind everyone racism had no place in the skies or anywhere else. Outside the gate, reporters and travelers stopped in their tracks, phones lifted to record the unfolding scene. One bold journalist called out, "Agent Harris, can you comment on what happened on board?" Marcus didn't break stride, simply offering justice. That's all. Later that evening, Marcus sat in a quiet corner of a small Arlington cafe, nursing a cup of black coffee as the adrenaline faded. His phone buzzed with a message from the Bureau's deputy director, handled perfectly. "We got your back." Marcus allowed himself a faint smile, knowing the story would make headlines, spark debates, and, hopefully, inspire change. The racist passenger would face charges for harassment, false statements, and attempting to interfere with federal duties. But for Marcus, the real victory was the moment mid-flight when he saw passengers of all colors and backgrounds stand up with him against hatred. That, he thought, was how change happened, one person refusing to bow, one crowd refusing to look away. As he finished his coffee and stepped into the cool night, he felt the weight of his badge a little differently, less as a burden, more as a promise to stand tall, even at 35,000 feet, when the world tried to push him down.